Welcome to this tutorial, where I'll show you how to set up embedded signing in Java using Dropbox Sign. E-signature solutions like Dropbox Sign give you the flexibility to let users sign documents from anywhere. These solutions not only ensure that documents are legally compliant, but also simplify the interaction between users and businesses, making the process of signing documents more efficient. A well-built e-signature product should work across operating systems and devices, encrypt and secure the transfer of documents between the sender and the receiver, track the document and notify users of their options such as signing, reviewing, and downloading the document, integrate with third-party software used for document creation and storage. In this tutorial, I'll show you, the developer, how to use embedded signing in a Spring Boot Java application. I'll set up the initial application, create the template, set up the webhooks, and write the logic for handling the signature request. Finally, I'll test everything to make sure it works correctly. All the code for this tutorial is linked in the video description. Feel free to clone and run the sample in the GitHub repo if that approach works better for you than following along. In this scenario, I'm a developer working at an employment agency that requires candidates to sign an NDA before they can view available work opportunities. I'm going to use Dropbox Sign to embed the e-signing functionality into the agency's website. If you're following along, you'll need a Dropbox Sign account. You can create a free account from Dropbox Sign's API pricing page, which is linked in the description. You'll also need Java. Version 8 or above is recommended. This tutorial uses Java 17. Please note that some versions may need additional JAXB API dependencies. You'll also need a build tool like Maven or Gradle. This tutorial uses Maven. And you'll need Spring Boot, a microservice-based web framework. If this is your first time using Spring Boot, you might want to check out the Spring Boot Getting Started docs linked in the description. Finally, you'll need ngrok or another tunneling service to receive event notifications from Dropbox Sign. All the links for these resources can be found in the video description. To start things off, I'll navigate to start.spring.io to create a sample Spring Boot application using the Spring Initializer. I'll select Maven as the project type and leave Java as the language, and then set a group, artifact, and name. I'm using co.moonhelm, sign app, and sign app. Now it's time to add my dependencies. So I'll click Add Dependencies. I'll add 2. First, I'll search for Spring Web and click on it. Then, I'll add the Spring Boot DevTools dependency. Once I've added those dependencies, I'll click on the Generate button, which will download a zip of the generated project. I'll click Save and unzip it. Then, I'll open my IDE of choice, which is IntelliJ. I'll start up my IDE, click on Open, and locate the extracted folder on my desktop. It should only take a few seconds to load. Once the project is open, I need to install the Dropbox Sign Java SDK. To do that, I'll open the pom.xml file, scroll to the end of the dependencies array, and add a dependency. I'll make the group ID com.dropbox.sign and add the artifact ID Dropbox Sign. Then I'll add my version tag here, which is 2.0.0. If you're installing the SDK in a Gradle-based project, you'll need to add the line implementation com.dropbox.sign Dropbox-sign 2.x.x. Now I'm going to make sure I load the Maven changes before moving ahead. Then I'll open up the application properties file under Source, Main, Resources. In this file, I'll store external variables that will help me access the Dropbox API. I'll also add additional details to the template that my users will sign. For now, I'll just define these variables in the file. The first one is the client ID, which I'll retrieve from my Dropbox Sign account along with my API key. When I'm in my Dropbox Sign account, I'll also need to create a template and provide its template ID there. This template will be used for all the signing requests generated by the app. Inside the template, I'll define a signer, the person who will be signing the document. The signer will have a role, a name, and an email. But before I can do any of this, I need to sign into my Dropbox Sign account. If you're following along and don't already have an account, you can use the link in the video description to create one. or visit dropbox.com/products/dropboxsign-API/pricing. To sign into my account, I'm going to navigate to app.hellosign.com and sign in with my username and password. Then I'll click on API, which will take me to my API settings. If you don't have an API key already, you'll have to click on the Generate Key button. I already have a key, so I'll simply copy the API key and go back to my IDE and update that in my DS API key. Next, I need to create an API app to use embedded signing features. To create the app, I'll click on the Create App button. At this point, I need to choose a unique name for my API app. I'm going to use Sign App. Then for the domain, I'll use example.com. I can always change this name later if I want to. I'll come back to this API app later to add the event callback URL. For now, I'll click on the Create Application button to get the client ID associated with the API app. I'll copy the ID, go back to my IDE, and paste it into the application.properties file. Now, I've retrieved the keys I need to authenticate with the Dropbox Sign API, and it's time to create a template in my Dropbox Sign account. To do that, I'll go to Templates, and then I'll click on Create Your First Template. I'll upload the file I want to turn into a template and click Next. I'm using this NDA form that I got from the Dropbox Sign Resource Center, but you can use any PDF document that fits your use case. Once my file has been uploaded, I'll click Next. This takes me to the page where I need to add signer roles to the template. You can have multiple roles in the same template, but for now, I'll just use the one and name it Freelancer. Then I'll click Next. Now it's time to set up the fields for the signer, such as full name, email address, and company. To keep things simple, I'll scroll down to the end, find the signature field, and drag and drop the signature field where I want it. If you want to experiment with other fields, you can add the full name field in the form below the signature field. Once I'm finished adding fields, I'll click Next and name my template. I'm using Non-Disclosure Agreement. Then I'll add any CC recipients and include a message for the email body that goes out with the signed document. For embedded signing flows, emails to signers are muted and CC recipients are the only ones that are emailed. I'll click Save when I'm ready to save the template. Once the template has been saved, I'll be able to view it in my templates list by clicking on the 3 dots on the right-hand side of my screen and selecting View Info. I'm going to expand the More Information accordion and copy the template ID. Then, I'll paste this template ID into my application.properties file. At this point, I'll update the signer name, email, and role. The name can be anything, but the role needs to be Freelancer. I'm going to create a new package inside the project named Controller. The controller will redirect incoming requests like the embedded signature request with a template to the appropriate service. It also handles the event payloads from the Dropbox Sign API, which I'll add later. Inside the controller package, I'll create a new class called Dropbox Sign Demo Controller. For now, I'm going to leave this as a bare-bones class. I'll just add the REST controller and request mapping annotations. These annotations map requests for all the requests that are received under the API route. Next, I'll create another package named Service. In this package, I'll create a new class named Dropbox Sign Demo Service and add the service annotation. I'll add the logic for this later. Now, it's time to create a webhook handler. Dropbox Sign uses webhooks, also known as events and callbacks, to notify your app or website about changes to signature requests as they occur. In this tutorial, I'll use webhooks to process Dropbox Sign events related to my embedded signature request. While the sample code only logs events, in a production application, you could also use that information to trigger specific actions like downloading signed documents or automating something. When I'm creating a webhook, I need to define a logger in my controller class and add the necessary imports. Then, I need to @AutoWire an environment object that allows me to access my credentials and authenticate with the Dropbox Sign API. If you're following along, make sure you import it correctly. Then, I'll create a webhook function. This function returns a string value and receives the JSON string passed via the request as a body parameter. This will throw an exception. I'll make sure that it has a post mapping that allows it to handle post requests sent to the sign/webhook endpoint. Inside this webhook function, I'll process the JSON that has been passed to it. Then I'll create a new event callback request object from the JSON string that was passed via the parameters. Now it's time to grab my Dropbox API key and save it in a variable so that I can easily access it in the next few steps. I'll grab the key using the getProperty function on the env object. The property name is dsAPI-key. I need to make sure that the request I receive is valid, essentially meaning that the event is complete and has all the details I need to be able to process it. I can do that using the isValid static function from the event callback helper class, but I'll need my API key for this. First, I'll extract the event payload using the getEvent function on the event. Then, before implementation, I need to check if the request is valid. If it is, then I need to retrieve the event type of the callback using the getEventType function on the payload object and put it into a switch case statement so that I can handle multiple types of events differently. In the first case, I'm going to look at callback test events. I'll use the logger to log a message that says callback test payload received and dump the payload so that the developer can see what payload was passed to the request. I'll add a break statement that closes this case. Then I'll define another case called signature request sent. I'll use the logger again to write the message signature request sent. I'll add a break call, then define another case, signature request viewed. I'll use the logger once again to print the message the signature request was viewed. I'll add a break statement and add another case, signature request signed, which prints the message the signature request was signed. I'll add one more case, signature request all signed, which prints the message the signature request has been signed by all parties, and then one final case, signature request downloadable, which prints the message the signed document can now be downloaded. I'll add a break and then add a default case in which I'll essentially print that a DS event occurred that has not been handled by one of the cases listed above. I'll print the event type and add a break statement. And now I'm done with my switch case. Now I need to return something from this post endpoint. Since the return type of this function is a string, I'll return a string that says hello API event received. You need to return this exact string from the webhook endpoint so that the Dropbox servers know that you were able to receive and process the webhook payload successfully. Then it's time to run my server so it can send Dropbox Sign a response. The server starts successfully, then I've successfully configured my controller. At this point, my Spring Boot app is running and I'm ready to handle Dropbox Sign events, but my API app in Dropbox Sign doesn't know where to send them. In the next step, I'll expose my local host, construct a callback URL, test it, and save it to my API app. To do this, I'll use a tool called ngrok, which is an HTTP tunneling service that gives me a remote web-based address for my local host-based demo app. If you haven't installed it already, you can use the link in the video description to do so. I've already set up ngrok, so I'll open a new terminal window and run the command ngrok http 8080. 8080 is the default port for Spring Boot's apps. If your app is running on a different port, make sure to update the command. When ngrok runs successfully, it generates an HTTPS URL for my app. I'll copy the URL and go back to my Dropbox Sign homepage and click on API. Then I'll click on the Edit button next to the Sign app that I created. I'll paste the event callback URL from ngrok, and I'll make sure to add the webhook handling endpoint for my controller, which is /API/sign/webhook. That's the public address to my webhook handler. Then I'll click on Test. If it works correctly, I'll be able to see a test payload printed in my IDE's console. This is what it looks like. The message callback test payload received has been printed. Since the event type string matched with the callback_test event type, this confirms that I set up the URL correctly. If your test failed, verify that your Spring Boot app is running and responding with Hello API event received. You also need to verify that the API's app's callback URL matches your ngrok URL appended with the webhook endpoint, which is ngrok URL API sign webhook. Note that anytime ngrok is restarted, you will need to update your app's callback URL. Now I'll click on Update Application to save the changes. The final step in this process is to create the signature request logic in my service. I'll open up my IDE again and head over to the service file I created earlier. I need to access the environment variables again through an @AutoWired environment object. I'll name it env. Then I'll create a function called sendEmbeddedSignatureRequest, which I'll use to generate and send signature requests from this service. Then I'll access the values I added to the application.properties file from the environment. Inside this method, I'll need to create an API client. Then, I need to configure the API client by setting my API key value as the username of the API key object. Now that I have Dropbox Sign API client, I can create a signature request API client using it. Then I'll need to define the signer's details. I'll create a new sub-signature request template signer object and pass in the signer's role, name, and email in chained method calls. Then I'll create a sub-signing options object that sets how the signer can sign the document. Next, I'll create a signature request create embedded with template request by passing in the template ID and the signer details. I'm going to make sure to set the test mode as true to ensure that I'm not using any credits from my account. Once the embedded request is ready, I can use the signature request API client to create an embedded signature request. If the signature request is created successfully, I'll be able to access the signature URL using an embedded API client. I'll need to create an embedded API client and use the embedded sign URL method on it to retrieve and return the embedded signing URL. If the signature request is not successful, an exception with the error details will be thrown, which you'll need to handle in a try-catch statement. Now, I'll come back to the controller class to configure an endpoint for this service, and I'll create an @AutoWired object for this service. Then, I need to create a new function to route the requests coming from embedded signatures to the service. To do that, I'll create a public function with a string return type and name it embedded signature request. Inside this function, I need to return the output from the Dropbox Sign demo services.sendEmbeddedSignatureRequest method. I'll make sure to add a post mapping here that allows it to receive requests from sign/embedded sign endpoint. This completes the development of the backend app. Now, I'll restart the server to make sure that my latest changes are reflected, and then I'll test it using any tool. I'll use curl, but you can use Postman or your preferred HTTP client. I'll open up a new tab in my terminal and type in the command curl-xpost and copy the URL from ngrok. Then I'll combine that URL with /API/sign/embedded sign. Mine looks like this. I'll send the request to the endpoint and wait for the server to respond with the signature URL. Since this is a test app, I can't go into the browser and navigate to this URL to access the embedded signing feature. But I can use the embedded testing tool that Dropbox Sign provides to test signature URLs in development. To do that, I'll go back to my browser and open up a new tab and navigate to app.hellosign.com/API/embedded test. I'll need to provide two things, my client ID and the embedded URL. I already have the embedded URL returned as part of the response. I'll copy and paste it here. Then I'll open up my IDE and retrieve the client ID and add it as well. Before clicking on Launch Embedded, I'll make sure to click on Show Advanced Options and turn on the test mode. For security, Dropbox Sign verifies that the signing page is being embedded on a website that matches the website configured in my API app. I'll need to turn that off before trying to embed using the testing tool. Now that I've confirmed that test mode is on, I can click Launch Embedded. This will trigger the embedded signing flow in my dialog. Because this is a test scenario, I'll see a disclaimer stating that this is not legally binding. I'm going to scroll down towards the end of the document and look for the fields where I added the signature input. I'll click on the Sign field to sign and enter my signature. Once I've added that info, I'll click on Continue and I agree. This completes the signature flow. Now I can go back to my IDE and see if all the events were captured and handled by my webhook. I can see that there was a signature request that was sent. Then the signature request was viewed, signed by one individual, and was made downloadable. Once all parties signed the request, then the signature request and the signed event were triggered. And now I've completed an embedded signing flow all the way through. If you're receiving errors when you send your post requests, you may need to add JAXB API dependencies. If that is the issue, then add the following to your pom.xml file under the dependencies section. To see the entire code for this tutorial, don't forget to check out the GitHub repository linked in the video description. As you've seen from this article, the Dropbox Sign API is a great way to integrate embedded signatures into your Java Spring Boot app. You can try using this feature with white labeling for a truly seamless signing experience. Dropbox Sign provides a variety of other useful features for your software, as well as hands-on API support. You can also embed other features to give your users the ability to create templates or signature requests from inside your app. Happy coding!